There are moments in history when the world feels like too much, too loud, too divided, too heavy with grief and uncertainty. In those moments, people search for places where they can breathe again, places where they can remember who they are when the wider world tells them otherwise. This month, as we honor Black History Month, we remember that generations of Black Americans learned, often out of necessity, how to create such places. What author and teacher Margaret J. Wheatley calls islands of sanity, spaces where dignity could flourish even when the surrounding world denied it. Spaces where hope could be practiced, protected, and shared. And today, I want us to reflect not only on those islands, but on how they became the very foundations of Black liberation and the continuing struggle for racial equity. Because these were never just places of comfort. They were places of transformation. When we look honestly at Black history in the United States, we see people repeatedly creating community in the face of systems designed to fragment and dehumanize. During slavery, enslaved people gathered secretly in hush harbors, hidden places in the woods where they sang, prayed, and affirmed their humanity beyond the reach of surveillance. These gatherings were not only spiritual refuges, they were acts of resistance. They nurtured hope, preserved African cultural memory, and reminded people that they belonged to something larger than oppression. Those gatherings were islands of sanity. And they mattered because they kept alive a vision of liberation long before emancipation arrived. Even when freedom was denied by law, freedom was practiced in community. After emancipation, Black communities built churches that became far more than worship spaces. They were schools, meeting halls, organizing centers, mutual aid societies, and political education hubs. When segregation sought to isolate and diminish, these congregations created safety and belonging. When economic justice threatened survival, they pooled resources to help families endure. When racism insisted Black voices did not matter, pulpits proclaimed divine worth and human dignity. The Black church became an island, not separated from the world, but deeply engaged within it. And from these sanctuaries emerged leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose theology of beloved community drew directly from this tradition, the idea that spiritual life and social justice are inseparable. The songs sung in those churches strengthened marchers crossing bridges in Selma. The prayers spoken in sanctuaries turned into strategy meetings for nonviolent protests. The island was never the destination. It was the place where people gathered strength to change the wider world. Not all islands were churches. During the era of segregation, Black educators created schools that affirmed excellence despite profound inequality in funding and resources. Teachers often used their own money to provide books and supplies, communicating to young people that their minds and futures mattered. Families turned homes into spaces of resilience, places where children learned pride in who they were, even when society attempted to teach shame. Neighborhoods fostered economic ecosystems, barbershops, beauty salons, social clubs, where conversation, culture, and collective care flourished. These spaces were not accidental. They were deliberate responses to exclusion, and they fostered liberation by cultivating confidence, solidarity, and leadership. Consider the Montgomery bus boycott. We often focus on Rosa Parks' courageous refusal to surrender her seat, and rightly so. But the success of the boycott depended on something bigger: community infrastructure. Churches organized carpools. Neighbors walked miles together. People shared rides, meals, and encouragement. For over a year, ordinary people sustained one another in a collective act of resistance. Those support networks, those islands of mutual care, were what made sustained action possible. Liberation did not happen because of a single moment of courage. It happened because communities created spaces where courage could be sustained. Another example comes from the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s, a flourishing of literature, music, art, and intellectual life. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, artists, musicians, and thinkers gathered in salons and community spaces to imagine new ways of being Black in America. These were cultural islands, places where creativity challenged stereotypes and redefined identity. Art became a form of liberation. When society tried to limit Black life to narratives of suffering, artists insisted on joy, complexity, beauty, and possibility. They helped reshape how a nation understood itself. I want to pause here because this history is not only inspiring, it is instructive. The islands of sanity created throughout Black history were never about withdrawing from the world. They were about preparing to re-enter it with greater courage, clarity, and collective strength. And I wonder what that means for us now. Because we, too, live in a time that feels overwhelming. Many people feel exhausted by the pace of change, persistence of racial injustice, and the fear that progress is fragile. It is tempting to retreat into private comfort. But history reminds us that comfort alone has never created equity. Community does. As Unitarian Universalists, we know how to create welcoming spaces. We value inclusion, compassion, and thoughtful reflection. But Black history invites us to ask a deeper question. Are our communities simply safe, or are they transformative? An island of sanity is not just a place where we feel better. It is a place that equips us to act. If the Black church taught us anything, it is that spiritual grounding must lead to public courage. If the civil rights movement taught anything, it is that justice grows when ordinary people organize together. If the Harlem Renaissance taught anything, it is that imagination can reshape reality. So what does it mean for us, here and now, to build islands that foster liberation and racial equity? It might look like supporting Black-led organizations and initiatives in our community, learning and telling fuller histories, especially those that have been overlooked, showing up in spaces where equity is being shaped, schools, housing conversations, community forums, examining how our own institutions can remove barriers and expand belonging. None of these actions are dramatic on their own, but neither were most of the acts that sustained the movements we now celebrate. History is shaped by consistent collective effort. Now, I want to speak pastorally, but honestly. It is easy to admire the courage of those who came before us. It is harder to recognize that their courage asks something of us. Black History Month is not simply about honoring heroes of the past. It is about understanding how communities created conditions for liberation and asking how we might do the same. The question is not whether we are perfect. The question is whether we are willing. Willing to move beyond awareness into participation. Willing to let our values become visible through action. willing to build islands of healing and justice that others can stand on. At the heart of all of these historical examples is something profoundly spiritual. People believed that a different world was possible. They practiced that world in small spaces before it existed on a larger scale. They sang about freedom before freedom was guaranteed. They taught dignity before society recognized it. They built communities of equity before laws reflected it. They lived as if liberation was already coming, and in doing so, they helped to bring it into being. Perhaps that is our invitation today, to become builders of islands, not islands of escape, but islands of courage. Places where people experience dignity, places where truth can be spoken, places where love organizes itself into action. Black history shows us that such islands do not merely protect people, they transform society. They foster liberation. They bend history toward justice because they nurture the imagination and resilience needed to keep going. May we be such a community. May our sanctuary strengthen us for the work beyond these walls. May we remember that the world we long for is built not only by grand gestures, but by communities willing to act together. And may we, inspired by those who came before us, go out and help create a world where equity is not an aspiration, but a lived reality. May we cause it to be so. Blessed be. Amen. Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. Thank you all so much.